I wanted to come and just talk about brand building, I think, for what I've been predominantly involved in, that is, predominantly more premium brands. And why that's important is a lot of what we do in the premium wine world is a lot of storytelling and a lot of marketing, which is, I think, something that a lot of companies and private label companies have begun to realize, is that there are ways that you can make the margins you need to make, but still tell a compelling story. And I think that's one thing that really sets brands apart. When we started into the wine world of production, we started with the historical brand. So I think it's really important to talk about the difference between a startup brand and sort of leveraging a historical. Right. So we have Heitz Cellar, and we took that and we've started to create spin-off brands. And frankly, that's a lot easier, right? We look at what Duckhorn's done with Decoy and so forth. They have so much equity in the market. They've got distribution networks. They've got, retailers, restaurants that are clamoring over buying the wines. I don't want to say it's easy, but it's easier, right? Than just sort of saying, hey, look, you know what? I really want to start this brand, whether it's for my restaurant, for my retail, for myself. It's far more difficult. You're really starting from a clean slate. So I really don't want to focus on that part of the industry. It's more focused on if, I've never been in the industry before and I want to start it, right? How do I start a brand? And I'd say one of the first things you sort of have to ask yourself is why? Is this actually a good idea? I think it's probably the first thing. And why I say that is it's a very romantic business. And I've been doing it my entire adult life, but I've also had failures and successes. No one ever writes about the failures in their articles. I've had 2 brands that were private labels, both failed. Personal. No one writes about that, right? They always write about Master Sommelier and things like that. I ask them not to write about it when they do, but that's an important part of the story. And through those failures, I've learned a lot of what not to do. And as my dad once told me, that some of the greatest life lessons is what not to do. I wish I had sort of asked more questions, maybe come to some of these before I started my own brand. I probably wouldn't have made as many mistakes. But what I learned from that was, for a brand to have longevity, and it can be easier to take a brand and constantly flip it. But I mean to build a brand that's going to have some maybe 10 to 15 years of lifespan, if not longer. It has to really have a unique identity and a reason for being that goes beyond just producing wine. Because, we all know that that's very easy to do, right? We could go with the book and we can create brands, right? Today, we could all sit around here with a case of wine and probably produce somewhere around 1,000 brands just in this room, between names and designs and so forth. But you really have to have, in my opinion, a compelling story that makes someone want to take the bottle off the shelf. And so you go, how do you do that, right? That's what we're talking about. First of all, you have to be passionate about what you're doing, right? And I was talking to someone earlier about this. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about the wine, right? And I think that's a misnomer where people think, well, you've got to be a great winemaker, you've got to be a master sommelier, you have this palate. There's actually some people who are just uber passionate about the business of wine, which is in and of itself incredibly fulfilling with the relationships and so forth that you can build. There's some people who are uber passionate about logistics, which is potentially one of the most significant contributing factors to making a brand successful is logistics and shipping. But ultimately, you got to find one part of that business that you're really you're really passionate about, or it really won't work because it's a very hard business, and to make $1, you have to work very, very hard. So when you're up at night looking at spreadsheets until your eyes burn, and then up early morning to get every time zone, calling people and trying to make things work, the only thing that's going to really drive you is going to be that one thing that you can focus on and say, this is the part of the business that I'm really, really passionate about, because some of the others will drive you insane. I went from never working at a winery to now overseeing 7 in about 3 years. And for me, there were two things of the business that I was really passionate about were nature and people. So even in my current role, we oversee 650 acres in the Napa Valley and 7 estates. I try to, as much as possible, pull myself out of the part of the businesses that I really hate and do them as little as I need to make everything successful. And then I constantly try to touch base with the things that motivate me. If not, I would probably quit or get rid of my shares and leave, right? So to keep yourself motivated, again, that's probably one of the driving forces behind brands being successful, is for you to find the part that you're really passionate about. And unfortunately, I have to tell you, money isn't enough because you would convince yourself that there are other ways I can make this money. So you have to find something about that brand, that business, that makes you want to get up every day and is a driving force enough that will distract you from the turmoil of the other parts of the business that are driving you crazy, right? Very, very important. For me, premium means that you have to pull yourself aside from set yourself apart from everything else, right? And how do you do that, right? We've recently seen the new go-to-market strategy of just celebrity collaborations. That's one way. I don't recommend it. It's an easy way to make sure that you don't actually own any of your brand and you give it away to someone who will actually do nothing, potentially show up once. So I don't recommend that. That doesn't really work very well. It works better for spirit brands. Wine brands, doesn't really work very well. The number one way to set your brand apart from everything else is quality. And there's so many presentations we can do. I can show you numbers and things like that. But ultimately, if the wine sucks and it's not very good, then ultimately it won't last very long. The brand will not last very long. People have so many options today. This is the most exciting time in the world for a wine buyer ever, right? You have so many options. You can almost go in a wine shop, throw a dart, and find a really good bottle of wine. It's one of the hardest times for a producer and someone who's selling wine because there are so many great wines in the world, and the competition is very, very stiff. So number one, before you look at your branding, your distribution, anything, is saying, how do I either produce or buy very high quality wine, right? And if that isn't the part of the business that you're passionate about, you say, hey, I'm a branding marketing guy. Get someone whose palate you trust on a consistent basis, whether it's a consultant or a friend, where you can say, hey, look, you're going to do the blends with me, right? And I'm going to take care of this. But the wine has to be good. Ultimately, you can get them to buy one bottle and get over on them, but they won't buy a second. And ultimately, for a brand to be very successful and to be around for a while, the wine has to be good. We probably put, if I were going to say time investment, 70% of our time is in making sure the wine is very good. Whether that is wines for estates that we own or brands that we've created, the wine is the number one priority. When you're going to distributors with a new brand, why would they buy it? Right? I mean, I'd imagine many of you have sat at those tables across from the big houses and said, hey, look, I got this brand, I really like you distributed. And they go, why would we do this? Right? If the wine's very, very good, that really gets you a big head start. And a lot of the guys who are making those decisions really do have good palates. A lot of them are people that I know. And even if they don't like the branding, if the wine's very good, you do have a very good chance or a better chance of getting in the door. But ultimately, if the wine is not good, maybe you fool them once, but it's very hard to fool them twice. And you will get this small bleep of success initially, and then it will go down. And you'll go, well, what happened? It's like, well, you cut corners on the most important part of the entire thing, which is what people are drinking. We have to remember that we get often distracted in the industry by a lot of things that we think are important, but people drink wine to have fun, right? I spent years studying very, very boring wine books to become a Master Sommelier, only to go back to realize that people usually don't care about a lot of those things. They really don't. I think we like to think that they do, but they really don't. The wine has to be very good and it has to be delicious first, and they have to enjoy it. People drink wine to forget about the serious things in life often. So what they don't is, they don't want a guy like me in a suit hovering over them, telling them what to drink. Typically, right? They want it to be delicious. So if you're investing in good juice and you're investing in good winemaking, you have a much higher likelihood to have a successful brand that's going to I'd say, surpass that 3-year window that was just discussed, right? That to me scares me. The idea of having a brand and have it last for 3 years, to me, like, turns my gut. There's so much work that goes into creating a brand, right? Now, once you're packaged, distribution and your network is probably the second most important part after the actual wine itself, right? People would say, well, what about the branding? What about the bottle shape and things like that? I go, yeah, but everyone's doing that, and that's sort of a no-brainer, right? Like, I mean, you know, you sort of pick your shape, so forth. I mean, in a wine shop, I don't know if that actually convinces people to buy wine that much anymore. Why? Because everyone does it, right? It's not going to give you competitive edge. What gives you competitive edge is great distributor relationships. If you can get a distributor behind your brand, they can make a brand, right? It's, for us, when I say it's a second priority, it's a very, very close second priority to the quality of the wine itself. And we actually realized that, so we actually created a separate company that only deals with our distributor relationships, because it's a lot of relationship building. It takes time, and in some cases it takes years. Because if you are a distributor and you have 2,000 producers in your warehouse, some of which you may have 30,000 cases at one time sitting in your warehouse, the last thing you actually need is another brand. They don't need it. They don't need us to create more brands. They might need more of the brands that already exist. So if you're coming to them with a brand, you've got to have a great relationship with them. What they're doing is they're taking a gamble on you, right? And they're gambling and they're investing in you with their money. So how do you convince a distributor to buy the wine, right? It's one of the hardest things you could do is actually convince them to buy the wine, because they actually don't need your wine, right? No distributor actually needs almost any brand. I'm talking from DRC to Petrus all the way down to box wine. They actually don't need any of them. They will be fairly successful without any of them, right? You've got to sell the wine for them, right? It's what no one wants to hear. You go, well, the distributor gets all this margin. Why would I sell the wine? It's like, well, you can hope that the world is one way, or you can live with the world the way it is. It's your choice. So what we realized was that what distribution companies were great is they were incredible partners for our brands. They did a great job selling, but they had a lot of brands to sell. So what we did was we hired a pretty large sales force, and it was a big capital investment, obviously, to go out and sell the wine first, to prove to the distributor, look, we've already got placements for these things, we've got commitments, pick up the wine. And they go, okay, who's going to say no to that, right? So this brings us to the topic of who is your buyer. We often start with the end result, the consumer. That's actually the last buyer, right? When we look at our buyer, we first start with our distribution partner, right? That's our most important buyer, right? There's a lot of really great wines that sit in warehouses and never get purchased, right? If you don't have great distribution, it's sort of death to a brand, right? From the very beginning. There are incredible wines all over Europe. Some of my friends make, some of the most amazing wines I've ever had in my life, and they will fail because they don't have good distribution. And that's very sad, but it's a reality. So the first thing we do is we build strong distribution relationships, right? We meet with them, and they're genuine relationships. We connect with the people we like, because when we leave that meeting and they buy our wine, we have to trust that they're representing the wine properly and they're preaching the gospel the way we want them to, right? They're not discounting the brand further than we want it to. They're not putting in accounts that doesn't really build my brand, it just hurts my brand, right? There's a big trust relationship there. The second buyer is either the retailer or the restaurant, right? So you have to build relationships there, right? I'm from the restaurant industry initially, so I have good relationships, but there's a lot of restaurants, people I've met, so what do? I go travel around, and I spend a lot of time at bars, right? A lot of time at bars. I don't actually like bar stools. I think it's the worst way to have a drink or have a meal at bars. I hate it, but it's the way you go meet people. You meet the bartender, you meet the buyer, and in one given night, I'll go to 4 different places, right? And I'll just go pop around every city. It's networking, right? Give them your card. Hey, look, R&DC, Southern Wine and Spirits, whatever the distributor is, they're going to be representing my wine. Hey, if they come by, I'd love you can pick up a case. I'd appreciate it. And then you follow up. You go home, fairly tipsy from the bar, and you go home and you email them and you thank them for the time, right? It's a lot of heavy lifting. This is how you build a brand that has longevity. And this is how you build relationships that'll keep buying. Then, how do you get the consumer to buy it, right? Very, very difficult. Well, then you have to go to the last account. You got to go to the retailer, you got to go to the restaurant, and you got to reconfirm. Great, you picked it up. Awesome. How are you doing? Do you need a little help selling it? Right? What does that mean? There's depletion, whatever they need. Sometimes you go in and buy a few bottles to show that you're supporting them. Right? Ultimately, what I'm getting to is the best way to build a brand is to not forget about, one, the thing that makes you most passionate about it, because selling wine is very difficult no matter who you are. And then second, the most important is, don't forget who your buyers are and that it is a people business, right? Ultimately, what we're doing here is we're trying to convince people to invest in us and to support us, right? If you don't have that, it doesn't mean that you can't be successful. There's some people who wiggle their way through and somehow figure it out. I don't know how to do that. Pretty much everything we've done that's been successful has been through relationship building. And to me, it's a tried and true way to make sure that when I go back to my office, I have an enormous amount of ambassadors that are out in the market that are preaching the gospel of our wines, even when I'm sitting at my desk. This is one of the best investments you can make. All right. Questions? I told you this isn't really my thing. Please. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between a regional brand and then an actual brand, like for you, between Napa and Heitz, for example?
You mean regionally appellated?
Yeah.
You know what? So this is interesting. We make wines. The question was sort of regionally appellated branded brands or, individual AVA branded. That's the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the interplay between the regional appellation and the producers that are working with it, and what that means to a producer who wants to capitalize on that regional brand.
I'm not sure I fully understand. So you're saying the difference between like you mean like North Coast AVA versus Napa? Is that what you're?
No, but like for a winery or producer who's operating in whatever AVA you want to choose, how much can the reputation of that brand, how much can they leverage, or how can they leverage the appellation of that brand to promote their individual brand?
You mean someone who's already planted in a region? How much can they take that? It's huge, and that's sort of what we started off with. If you've already got an anchor, you got a reputation, right? Pretty much all of your spin-off brands are like twice as likely, or if not more likely, to succeed, because you got a point of reference, right? Buying wine is someone's like a buyer has to have faith in it, right? People will often take chances with new wines, especially if they're not incredibly expensive. Again, people drink wine for pleasure. So I always say, what's the worst thing you're going to do is get drunk. Like, it's fine, and then if they don't like it, they won't buy it again. If they do, then they go, great, I got another favorite. Sometimes it's that simple for a lot of consumers. But if you already have a really strong brand, spin-offs from that are way more likely to be successful. Now, what you have to remember is, and this is why we never did a spin-off from Heitz, and we will never do a spin-off from Heitz, is you do weaken the main brand. That's a fact. Decoy, while it is the cash cow, I think hurt Duckhorn's stance in the market as a premium brand. But that was a calculated effort. That was a decision that was made. But you can't really deny it, right? You don't look at Duckhorn as a premium brand as much as you did before Decoy existed. But we like the margins from Decoy. It's a choice, right? We bought Heitz to heighten Heitz, not to wring out the rag, right? Every one of our brands is independently run and runs by itself, and it has to succeed in and of its own. It's very easy to leverage it. We could have taken Heitz and we could have made Heitz into like a 250,000 case brand with a secondary brand that's huge. We could have done all that. It's sort of a playbook. It works very well. It works very, very well. But you do weaken the main brand, which is your main investment. And if you have physical assets, it's really not worth it, because the long-term appreciation on hard assets, especially in high-value real estate areas, far surpasses any margin from an entry-level brand. Yes?
How important is appellation in terms of, from a consumer, or even if the buyer is the distributor? How important is the appellation itself?
I think that how important is the appellation? I think what a lot of regions are doing, which is great, is really trying to differentiate themselves, especially regions that were typically just thrown into state appellated wines or big regional appellations. And I think that's really, really great for the wine buyer. It's actually great for the growers and things like that as well, because they can sell things at a more premium price. Ultimately, I think that when we talk about the way you want things to be, or the illusion of the way you think things are and the way they really are, California appellated wines can still sell, I think, at the same price as something that has, a individual appellation. Can a Chardonnay label Santa Lucia Highlands, is it going to sell for that much more than Central Coast? I don't think so. Ultimately, it's quality is what it comes down to. There are some appellations that really have marketed themselves to be very, very premium, like the Napa Valley, right? It just always has. We look at the appellation of Bordeaux. It's one of the strongest brands in the world. I mean, it's insane. When you think of like in your mind, you have an image of Bordeaux, but then when you go visit Bordeaux, you're like, oh, this is Bordeaux. It's like a bunch of Sutter homes everywhere. It's insane. But they've done an incredible job of building the brand, which is Bordeaux. Napa has a very, very strong brand. I think that what we have to remind ourselves is that an appellation is never a guarantee of quality. There are very bad wines made in the Napa Valley, and there are really incredible wines made in Monterey, right? The consumer they're becoming more and more savvy, and I think as Americans are drinking more wine, their palates are they're more sure of what they like, which is great. It gives more guidance for us if we're actually trying to serve a market. Again, building a brand is another question, are you trying to serve a demand, or are you trying to build a niche? Building a niche is very difficult, as we know, versus just fulfilling a palate, a flavor profile that people already have a demand for. Appellation, I think, is becoming less and less important, in the sense that I think if the quality is good, the brand and the story are great, and you have great distribution, great relationships, I think you'll be fine. Sir?
So you mentioned that...
oh man, this guy took notes. I'm in trouble.
So you mentioned that value distribution network are great points in terms of building a brand.
Yeah.
You also mentioned that collaboration is not a good idea. Can you share some experience why it's not a good idea?
And this is, look, my grandmother, she hated when I curse in public, but sometimes it's just certain words that just really encapsulate what you're thinking. People can really see through bullshit. Like, certain products they're not very good at, but like with wine, it's sort of one of these things that there's very few celebrity brands, I think, that have taken off and never been looked at, something that's like legitimate. It's like, oh, cool, another celebrity wine brand. It's just not, they rarely have longevity. It will give you a really quick burst. But ultimately, again, you have to look at the deal. Any big celebrity that is worth partnering with is going to take a minimum of 50% of the brand, because they know that your brand, they're the ones giving it, the big jump. They typically also have a business management firm that's going to take a percentage as well. So that leaves you, the person who's actually doing all the heavy lifting, with maybe 30% of your brand when it's all done. So is it worth it? Would you rather sell 70% less wine and just keep everything in the house, control your own destiny? And then you have to deal with celebrities, which is never fun. Yes?
I have the mic already.
She's like, I bring my own mic.
Yeah, I brought my own mic to this event. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned formality being kind of a handicap to the industry, and so I'm wondering... It
is often, yeah.
Yeah, how to square, in your opinion, a premium brand story with something more casual, or stepping away from formality.
Yeah, it's difficult. And it's difficult because of the insecurity of wine drinkers and the idea that something is formal means more luxurious, right? Like, if I were here wearing what I would typically wear, which is probably jeans and a hoodie, versus a suit and tie, you would probably perceive me very different, right? It matters. It should matter, but it does matter. What I'm more discussing is how, when we actually have face-to-face interaction with consumers, it's important that I did this interview once, and they were like, well, what makes wine exclusive? It excludes so many people. And I said, well, I don't actually think wine is exclusive. There are really delicious wines that are $8.99, right? Absolutely delicious, right? It's marketed as exclusive. It's a difference. And, the $5 Pinot Grigio is marketed the same way as Chevalier Montrachet is, right? They're marketed identically. And there's very few products like that are marketed the same regardless of its price point. And not that every brand needs to go around and put a bunch of fuzzy animals on the label, but can we in our marketing efforts and the way we interact with guests be a little bit more approachable, right? A little more human. Like I always had a very big disconnect between the way I consume wines with like my other friends who may be master sommeliers, and then the way we projected ourselves at work and in public was very different. I always find it very odd. Like, who are we doing that for? Sir.
You talked a little bit about how you build relationships with bartenders.
Yeah.
But then building the relationships with distributors was number 2 on your list. How do you build those? You can't just go sit at a distributor warehouse and start drinking, in theory.
No, you can't. I think it starts with, the cold call is still very powerful in business. And if you're respectful, you're professional, and persistent. It's okay to annoy people sometimes, as long as you're really respectful and you don't come with an ego. It works very well. So cold calling people, sending the email, the follow-up, taking them out for a drink, they're human, huh? Right? You have to remember that. So, you sort of, with empathy, go, well, if I was in that position, how would I would be convinced to buy this brand? Or how would I convince this person to take a chance on me? And I think humility and drive and persistence will always win in business in almost anything you do. Because again, they do have the capital to invest in you. You just have to convince them to, is what it comes down to. I mean, even in existing brands, it can be very difficult, right? To convince distributors to really get behind the brand and push it. It's a lot of heavy lifting on their plate. Obviously we know compliance and logistics is not getting any easier. It's a huge pain. I hate it, to be honest with you. But again, it's a necessity, and they deal with a lot of that, and they've got a lot of mouths to feed, a lot of employees, and again, there's no shortage of wine in the world, and you just have to do, again, put yourself in that seat. Like, what would convince you to want to get behind the brand? Wine has to be good. If the wine's really good, it really helps. I'm just telling you. Like when you sit down with those guys and they drink the wine, they go, that's good. You're like already like 50% there. The other is like convincing them that it's not going to sit on their warehouse floor for very long, that you have a destination for it. It's like very important. Yes.
You've talked about quality so much. We represent a direct-to-consumer brand that sells wine across the U.S.
Yeah.
And quality is something that we're really struggling with because a Californian might like a big oaky Cabernet, and someone in New York might like a very drinkable, more European style. So if we send the California cab to the person in New York, they think it's shit, and they don't want to buy more of it, but yet the person in California does. So how do you take a balanced approach when palates vary across the nation?
Sure. Well, I think those are two different conversations. There's a distinct difference between style differential and quality. And even as a sommelier, I ran some of the best wine programs in the country, is when I would have young sommeliers start and they would tell me what they liked and they didn't like, and I would tell them that I don't care what you like and what you don't like. That's not what you're here for. You're here to make people happy by giving them wine that makes them happy. So ultimately, our first question is, what style of wine do you like? Right? It's like, to be a good sommelier, you're essentially just asking a lot of questions and then making recommendations according to like a certain range of wines that they like. As people who sell wine, we're sort of doing some of the same thing. So I would say you need to differentiate between the style first, and then the question is quality. Obviously, people say, well, quality is subjective. That's not completely true. Most people who say that are people who are peddling things that are low quality. Ultimately, you choose your style. And we know the styles. People who want lighter, more, crisp, fresh, vibrant wines, more minerality, or, typically people want a little bit more fruit, a little more luscious, more pleasure initially. And there's actually a middle range. I actually like to play in the middle often. But you go, great. And then within that, you have your tiers of quality. But it takes, that's part of the joy of what we do, is constantly tasting, drinking wines and assessing, being able to assess the quality of wine very, very quickly. And if your job is doing, selling wine direct to consumer, I think it's really looking at, again, what style of wines do they like, and then the conversation is quality. right? What else we got? All right. Thank
Any
you all.
more questions? We have time for more questions.
Please.
You mentioned that you think that the California. Oh, thank you. You mentioned that you think that that seeing California on a label is becoming more acceptable and embraced by consumers. Mm-hmm. What do you think is an exciting or up and coming region, or maybe not necessarily something new, but a region that's emerging with more excitement from consumers?
Sure. I think that we have California is massive. And I think that people who don't spend time actually driving outside of places like Napa don't realize like how massive the wine regions are in California, which is actually, it's a benefit. And when you go to visit these regions, you start to understand, I spend a lot of time in land, asset acquisition, in the business of grape sales and so forth and so on. So I understand that certain regions are in sort of cornered, right? I actually, believe it or not, I spend a lot of time in Lodi. I actually like it there quite a bit. One, because people aren't as pompous, frankly, and they really enjoy just drinking wine. They're very, very nice, and that's a relief. But I also like a lot of the wines. And I think that region, by actually looking at the different sub-regions of Lodi, bless you, and bottling them separate, you'll see a lot more potential. Now, where they are, between, my grandmother would say, a rock and a hard place, is they have these big contracts from big buyers who, it's guaranteed money, right? If you own land, you have no debt on it, and it's fairly profitable, you want guaranteed money. There's nothing better than guaranteed money. So for them to take a leap of faith and reduce yields, implement organic and biodynamic farming, and, to only make marginally more per ton, is a struggle. But there are some producers that are starting to do it, and Lodi is just one example of that. There's obviously, you have the subregions within the Central Coast as well that are, I think the quality is going up pretty tremendously. Obviously, as we know more about farming and people are more interested in it, in more detailed farming, the quality is going up. But I just feel, and I know it sounds silly because it's always been that place where people have just mass-produced wine, but Lodi still has an enormous amount of potential in the sense that I think very soon you won't just see Lodi, you'll see like the subregions of Lodi on the bottles, which I think is really exciting. Yeah. I mean, the soils are fantastic. I mean, there's a lot of really places there that have beautiful sandy and well-drained soils. The yields are just incredibly high, and they're not really incentivized to farm for very, very high quality wines. It's for high volume. There's a need for it in the market, as we know, and I drink those wines too. I drink all wines, but I just think that there are some growers that I think would be interesting to see them incentivized to grow higher quality grapes.